Welcome to today's edition of the Mindshift Cards Conversation, a part of our learning journey here at the Human School. In this episode, we're going to focus on a question that comes from our storyteller Compass Point. And that question is, why might we devalue our insider perspective? And then along with that, how might those around us also devalue our or their insider perspective as well? So the first thing that I have thought about when it comes to this particular mind shift comes from this place where I always doubt that I have the right approach or the skills within any given situation. So part of this devaluing my insider perspective is perhaps a lack of trust or faith that I have in my own knowledge. I doubt my own expertise. And a statement that someone one time said that I've always held on to is, we are not experts, we have expertise. And so I don't know whether that lends a lot to the conversation, but it helps ground my thinking in that you're never done learning and you're never done figuring it out. So my first instinct around this is about maybe a lack of faith or a trust in my own knowledge.
Mm.
Go ahead, Bree. We both want to talk at the same time. That's okay. Go ahead.
My thought was around the idea of the insider. I often believe that other people know better, but I also wonder sometimes how being close to something might influence or bias me around a situation. So I'm always hyper interested in what other people think, especially people from an outside perspective, because I think sometimes it colors our closeness to a situation, colors our ability to see it clearly, but that sometimes that leads to some insecurity and a distrust of my actual insider perspective too.
So a couple things resonate with me here, and going back to Chad's idea of the insecurities and a wondering of like, so where does that come from? So what's causing that? And I think that a potential answer is that I think that our world kind of operates on that. And if not our world, well, at least the education world tends to operate on that. And I think I really sort of gained this idea of being a cheerleader for the insider perspective, having gone through my doctoral program, which was very much practitioner based, very much helped us see the value of the insider perspective and pushing back against that sort of higher education systemic view of doctoral programs that you can't study your own practice because, like Rachel said, you might be biased. And I think what we learned was, A, there is value in that insider perspective, and that you as practitioners, as insiders, have knowledge that nobody else has. And that there are ways that you can mitigate that idea of bias. There are ways in your methodology that you, when you're studying something, your practice, there are ways that you can mitigate that or be transparent about it. And sort of test that bias too. But for some reason, and now working in another higher education institution, I hear that a lot, like, no, you can't study your practice. Your dissertation cannot be on your practice. And I'm thinking, like, what a lost opportunity, because as an educational institution who's preparing leaders to lead in a world that's rapidly changing and full of chaos, we need those people with the insider perspective. We need to help people on the ground learn how to rigorously carry out an inquiry into what's going on there and not rely on somebody from the outside to sort of drone in and do their thing and drone out and devalue what those people on the ground actually see, hear, feel, value, are taking in. So I know that's a really long answer, but I think that our world and our system really creates that insecurity that you mentioned, Chad.
Well, one thing that was kind of interesting to me as I listened to both of you was, I wonder if I feel like an outsider in the traditional paradigm. And if there's something to that, when you're objecting to the world in which you live in, I don't feel much like an insider. I very much feel like an outsider. And I know that's not the intention of this mind shift. It's about seeing the value in the self and our own expertise. But I think when I kind of examine maybe why I don't feel much like I have expertise, it's because I think the expertise that I might lend maybe isn't valued by the paradigm I exist in, or seen by the paradigm I exist in either. And so the insecurity comes from the water around me is a very different temperature than the water that I'm, currently existing in. And I'm wondering if that's something that resonates with the two of you.
So as you're talking, one of the things that's going through my head is the insider-outsider perspective that's actually within our own field of education. How many times have we heard teachers say, my principal's, he's not in the classroom, he doesn't teach, he doesn't really understand, he doesn't know. Well, okay, your insider perspective as the teacher is really valuable. And how, as a leader, do we help leaders understand, to be open to that teacher perspective? They see things that you as the principal don't see. And also, your principal sees things that a teacher doesn't see. Right. And so we run, I think, a real risk too when we'd bifurcate things and we say you're either A or you're B. Choose a side. Right. And you're either the insider or you're the outsider. And then we start to use this language that really breaks down that idea that, we're all on the same team fighting this good fight.
Yeah, that I was thinking as I was listening to Chad talk, and now you, of whether perhaps the insider-outsider dichotomy does not help. And even if there's a language of ours that we should shift, I don't know what that would be. But does it create an us versus them mentality, or reinforce, not create, but reinforce that mentality in thinking of, if I'm an insider, you're an outsider, or if you're an outsider, then maybe maybe I must be an insider, vice versa. I think I said it the same way both times. But yeah, I'm wondering if that reinforces.
Well, I guess the thing that I also am thinking about as we've thought about this particular mind shift, though, is the idea of the collective expertise, right? So it's valuing the insider perspective, but then shifting into the collective expertise. And then how do we make decisions around, I guess, the value of that expertise and who those people are? And I think to your point that bifurcation or that polarized way of thinking about it doesn't treat each human as being somewhere on that continuum. Like, there are people who are valuable. Well, all people are valuable to the conversation, but especially valuable who have been maybe someplace that I was 3 years ago in my thinking. That doesn't make them less valuable. It's a reminder that there are people who are entering into this new thinking or thinking that we've become accustomed to, that's still valuable, we've forgotten about.
Yeah.
And this idea too, that you can have both perspectives. Like, I think that the way that the outsider perspective is framed is the outsiders are the people who create the theory, the ideas, and the insiders are the people who actually do the work.
Right.
Okay. They take that theory and they apply it and they make it real, but they don't create the theory. They can't create the theory because they're the insiders. They leave the theory to the outsider. So the way that we could reframe this is that everyone creates theory and everyone has a practice and actually implements theory. And as somebody who does theory, you can study your own practice so that you actually contribute to the theory.
Right. Yeah, I like that idea of reinforcing that everybody can be both or either.
It's interesting, and maybe I didn't get as deep with my thinking around this, but I look at insider and outsider. I didn't look at insider and outsider through that practitioner versus theory lens. I saw it more as, when you're an insider, you know something that maybe other people aren't aware of. So the lens that I brought to this was, as an insider, I understand something that maybe other people haven't seen yet. And that we oftentimes are doubting our beliefs because the consensus or the mass, the critical mass doesn't see it yet. So it's interesting because all this time we've been talking about this and I haven't seen it through that practitioner versus theory lens.
Yeah, I hadn't either.
So I wonder how that idea applies to the work that we're doing here. Are we insiders or are we outsiders?
Depending on where the line is.
Are we creating theory? Are we actually doing it?
Or are we embodying both? That's what I would say. If that's the goal.
Our goal is right. For both. I think that very intentionally as a group, we've talked about the desire to create something that is grounded in, I don't know if it's theory or framework. We've still, as we iterate and grow, we're not entirely sure, but that part of it, but that has to be built on a foundation of practice or of practicing. And I think part of this conversation is a perfect example of that, right? We don't have these conversations purely to talk at each other. It's to play with our ideas and to better understand them. I think this is a conversation is a perfect example of how even within a 10-minute conversation, it's changed my thinking or had me pause and think differently about something that I felt really familiar with.
Yeah.
So I wonder, as we start to rethink the human school and how we've launched and approached this, it goes back to what Rachel said, we're doing both. We're iterating this theory by having these kinds of conversations and bringing other people into the conversations and trying to hold it up and look at it from all different angles. And I think one of the things that we've been talking about most recently is how do we actually find those examples? Because one of the things that a number of people have said was, okay, interesting idea. Who's doing it? Where's it happening? And we're trying to now build a network of people, practitioners that are actually doing work that this theory could be mapped onto, or the work could be mapped onto the theory, however you want to look at it. Yeah. So I don't know. That's sort of off the top of my head.
No, and I don't know that I think would call it this as being practitioner based, but I do think even the act of having these conversations, right? So the whole design behind the Mindshift cards was an entry point for people to start to have the conversations. I think that's maybe like, it's not being a practitioner the way that we would traditionally define it, but the act of having the conversations that challenge or object or cause us to clarify theories is an example of also being a practitioner. And then hopefully it then steps people into the physical act of making and elevating the conversation in the classrooms or in the schools. And so the hope would be that by having these conversations and asking these questions, people are doing the work of starting the conversation too.
I agree.
Well, definitely want to thank you guys for a rich conversation tonight. We are so grateful for those of you out there who are participating and listening, and we hope that at some point you'll join our community on Facebook, and also visit thehuman.school and the Learning in Public Hub for a lot of other resources. And to kind of tie it all together, we are a community hoping to place humanity at the center of all of our design. And so it's been so great to have this conversation, guys.
Thanks.
Always fun. Have a good night.